Uh, so I'm Ji Zhu. I'm a professor in the Department of Statistics at the University of Michigan. I'm also the IMS representative for the JSM's program committee this year, and that's why I'm the chair of this Medallion Lecture. And to start with, I will introduce our, this is the third Medallion Lecture at the JSM this year. So I will start with introducing our Medallion lecturer today, Alicia Carriquiry. So Alicia Carriquiry was born in Montevideo, Uruguay, where she received a degree in engineering. She came to the United States for her graduate education, first at the University of Illinois, and then at Iowa State, where she received a PhD. Carriquiry joined the faculty in statistics at Iowa State in 1990, and is currently Distinguished Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and also President's Chair in Statistics. Since 2015, she is Director of the Center for Statistics and Applications in Forensic Evidence, a NIST Center of Excellence. She is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and of the American Academy of Forensic Science, and is also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Statistical Association, the Institute of Mathematical Statistics, the International Society for Bayesian Analysis, and the International Statistical Institute. She was elected fellow of the Heckler Institute for Advanced Studies at Texas A&M University in 2023. Carriquiry's research interests include Bayesian methods, sampling, study design, and application of machine learning approaches in biological and forensic problems. She has worked extensively on problems in human nutrition, and in the last several years has established an active research program in forensic statistics. She has published about 160 peer-reviewed articles and has mentored 23 doctoral students, about 45 master's students, 8 postdoctoral researchers, and many brilliant undergraduates. And now, each year, IMS nominates 8 Medallion lecturers in fields across the IMS subject range. The award of a medallion signals the honor inherent in being selected to give one of these lectures. IMS awards the medallion to Alicia Carriquiry and invites her to present a medallion lecture entitled Statistics and Its Application in Forensic Science and the Criminal Justice System. And there's a medal that the IMS would like to present to Alicia.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Apologies for walking in late. I swear I thought it was 2:30. Imagine if I missed my own medallion lecture. All right, so now that I got my breathing back, thank you so very much. It's a real honor. It doesn't matter how many invitations or how many years, every new invitation is such an honor, and I'm very pleased to be here. So let me see, how do I get to the next slide? There we go. So the United States, I always start with this bummer. The United States is one of the countries in the world, I think we rank 5th in terms of the number of, the proportion of its inhabitants it throws in jail. Mass incarceration has been going on for many, many years, and as you can imagine, the more people in jail, these are the incarceration rates just among the NATO countries, the more people in jail we have, the bigger the chances for wrongful convictions. There's at this moment about 2 million individuals in prisons throughout the country, and of course it's impossible to know exactly how many are wrongfully imprisoned, but it is estimated that about 4 to 6% of people currently in jail actually are innocent of the crime they were accused of committing. That means that may not be, it may not seem a very high percentage, but that amounts to about 100,000 people, which is a lot of people. And as you can imagine, most of the people that are, this is not an equal opportunity type of issue. Most of the people that are in jail and most of the people that are wrongfully convicted tend to be black and brown people. And these populations are overrepresented among inmates. There's many reasons for the wrongful convictions. I listed a few there. Mistaken eyewitness identifications, perjury, false accusations, false confessions. People amazingly tend to confess just to stop being interrogated. Finally, they say, yeah, I did it, and reach some sort of a plea deal. False or misleading forensic evidence, that's a green one over there, and then official misconduct. And I should add, official misconduct here means many different things, but among the things that it includes is widely exaggerated claims or conclusions from forensic technologies that were used in court, and I'll mention that a little bit more in a little bit. So I will focus on the question of false or misleading forensic evidence, and that's what we do at CSAFE, is looking at forensic methods and trying to understand what is the scientific and the probabilistic foundations of these forensic methods. As it turns out, many of the forensic methods we've known for years, the CSI type things, right? So latent print analysis and footwear analysis and this kind of things, those are pretty ad hoc. They were developed as needed, if you will, in crime labs by law enforcement, and most of these have never, ever been truly tested or validated. There's been recently a little push to test some of these methodologies, but again, I'll talk about some of the issues involved in those tests. Forensic DNA analysis is the exception, but recently, with the advent of methods to analyze mixtures, so DNA mixtures with 3 or 4 or 5 donors to the mixture, or the new thing about touch DNA, they go get some DNA from a doorknob, for example, and if you happen to be unlucky enough to open that door, even though you had nothing to do with a crime, your DNA may show up in one of these mixes. The thing about these technologies is that once they have been admitted in court, they are pretty difficult to kill. There's precedent in the US system, and the gatekeepers, if you will, the people that decide whether something is scientific enough or not, are the judges. And the judges, much as they know about the law, tend to know very little about science. And so this is a real issue because, like I say, precedent typically, courts will go, well, yeah, you might contest this technology, but there's precedent. All these other, this was used in all these other trials, and therefore. And the most concerning, I think, the most ad hoc disciplines are what's called the pattern comparison disciplines. And those are, think of anything that can be represented as an image. So for example, the markings that you would see on a bullet after it has been fired, striations, or fingerprints that are left at a crime scene, or shoe and tire prints, bloodstain patterns. Somebody gets shot and there's this pattern of blood droplets on a wall. This is what we call pattern comparison disciplines, and essentially what the way examiners go about evaluating the value of that evidence is they get the image from the crime scene pattern, and then they get a reference image, for example, an image of the suspect's shoe, and then pretty much they visually compare these two images and decide whether they're similar enough to conclude that they have a common source, or whether they're not that similar and therefore we cannot conclude same source. And so this is very subjective, very very non-reproducible, if you will. It greatly depends on the examiner's level of expertise and, you know, I suppose, eye for patterns. So this is the outline for the rest of the talk. I'll talk a little bit about what might be junk images or junk evidence, other types of evidence that really there appears to be a signal, and we can work with that. And then talk a little bit about the forensic questions of interest, the statistician's formulation of the forensic problem, and then I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about interpretation and transparency of the methods we use in the forensic context. All right, so this is junk forensics. This is a bank robbery that was committed in South Florida many years ago, and the photos on the left are the surveillance cameras from the photos. They take photos of this person wearing this shirt, and those are the two photos on the left. These ones over here, and then the photos on the right are a similar shirt. And the marks here are where the examiner, this was an FBI examiner, said the stitching in these parts of the shirt are identical. And therefore, this must be the same shirt. This is a mass-produced shirt made in China, most likely, right? Mass-produced shirt. And the guy came up, the odds of finding a shirt with the same stitching patterns, according to this FBI agent, was 1 in 650 billion, give or take a few billion. And, you know, where did these numbers come from? Your guess is as good as mine, because there was never any published study that looked at the probability of finding two shirts produced by the same manufacturer with a similar stitching pattern. This guy, by the way, was sentenced to 92 years in prison on the basis of that evidence. Now, this is what we call junk. This is what we call reasonable evidence. We know there's a signal there. The question is, how do we find it? So what you see on the left is the inside of the barrel of a gun. And you can see markings. So you can see these grooves things. Those are called, this is part of what's called the rifling. And then you see these more elevated parts. And here you have a bullet, the top of an ammunition. And this is what's called a bullet land. And this bullet land, you can see, has all these striations over here. These are microscopic. And these striations are left when the bullet travels down the barrel of the gun because of microscopic imperfections on the inside of the barrel. Now, these imperfections can be, we can look at them and we can ask ourselves, can the pattern of striations be enough to tell whether this bullet may have been fired from this gun? So that's the question, right? And, I won't be a party pooper, but the answer is yes. You can use these striations to come up with a pretty solid probability of same gun or different gun, but I'm not going to go into that today. But there is a signal in this type of evidence. So patterns, so let me go back a little bit and talk about patterns. So patterns, here you have some bloody fingerprints at a crime scene. Here you have two fingerprints. Here you have two bullets. This is bullet 1, this is bullet 2, and being compared to see whether the striations coincide one bullet to the next. And so the way this goes is examiners might find some pattern at the crime scene, then they get some reference patterns to compare the crime scene pattern to, for example, prints from the suspect or test shots from the gun of the suspect or what have you, and then, like I said, visually compare these images and then make an assessment of whether the similarity allows them to conclude that the defendant, in fact, was at the crime scene and probably was the source of the pattern that was observed. And so this is, like I was saying, this is all very subjective, very individual dependent, and so the question is, are they any good at what they do? And it turns out there's been what we call black box studies. These were recommended in 2016 by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And what they do is they treat the examiner as a black box. And so they have participants, and they show each participant a bunch of comparisons. For example, 3 bullets that were known to be fired from the same gun, plus a question bullet. And so that would be one comparison kit, and then there may be, 10 of those or 80 of those or whatever, and the examiner has to decide whether that question bullet matches the reference shots or not. And so typical responses are identification, exclusion, or sometimes inconclusive. And identification is, yes, these are similar enough, and I think they have the same source, and no, these are not similar enough, different source. And inconclusive is, I really cannot tell. So the result of these black box studies are pretty impressive in the sense that if you look at the false positives and false negatives, in other words, the wrong identifications and the wrong exclusions, they tend to be tiny. So the last firearms black box study, for example, suggested that the proportion of false positives is a fraction of 1%. The proportion of false negatives is a little higher, but like 3% or what have you. The problem is that these studies are terrible. They are really poorly designed, and they are very poorly analyzed. The participants are all selected. So these are volunteer participants. There's a ton of missingness in this study, in this type of studies. This is never accounted for. So a participant may receive 50 kits for comparison, may return 27, and whatever happened to the other 23 doesn't matter. Inconclusives tend to be counted as correct. So if a person says, I cannot tell, this is an inconclusive decision, but another person tells, yep, this is an identification, they're both correct. And so that would not be an issue if the proportion of inconclusives in these studies were relatively low. But it turns out, for example, that in the last firearms study that I mentioned, the proportion of inconclusives is above 50%. And so, by the time you look at this data, you really want to shoot yourself, but no pun intended. And then, there's low possibility of false positives. So, they gave these examiners 2/3 of their kits are ground truth non-match, and 1/3 is ground truth, the other way around, ground truth match, and the other 1/3 is ground truth non-match. So there's always a smaller chance of a false positive than a false negative. And the studies are very uneven in terms of difficulty, so you really cannot compare one study to the next. I have to say that, disappointingly, one of these studies was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last year, 2023. Aside from all of these mistakes, all of these issues in the study that this guy published, there were any number of other statistical mistakes that, just went through the review process. These people, by the way, the title of their talk was Validity of Cartridge Case Comparisons. And from this type of study, they generalized to the entire population of firearms examiners and say, cartridge case comparisons are valid because of our results. People get put in jail because of these things. So there's many red flags in these studies. They have very high accuracy, but very low repeatability. So if you show the same examiner the same sample 6 months later, there's, about 70% of them reach the same conclusion. 30% of them change their conclusions. And reproducibility, which is when you show the same comparisons to 2 or more examiners, is even lower, about 64% for question documents, for example, a little higher for latent prints. So not all pattern comparison disciplines are as bad. Some of them are, not all of them are. Now, one could not really dump too much on examiners because these are difficult problems. So here you might go to a crime scene and find, this type of images. This is a shoe print on a piece of paper. Maybe the guy used the paper to step on a chair, who knows. This is the same shoe print, but now it has been treated with some chemicals. And if you have a defendant and the defendant has a shoe, this might be images from the defendant's shoe, you need to answer whether this particular shoe was the one that left these images, these prints at the crime scene. This is data from the FBI lab that was recently released. It's a great data set. And here's, if you want to look at miserable images, look at this ones over here. And so it's not a shoe. There's, one question is to say, did a shoe with the same tread pattern leave this print? That doesn't tell you much, because if it's a Nike Air Max, there's about 5 bazillion Nike Air Maxes everywhere. You have to be able to identify the shoe. So that gets really, really complicated. So I'm going to pause there, and now I'm going to think as a statistician. So what is the statistical problem? Well, in our criminal justice system, we have 2 stories, right? These are competing stories. The prosecution says the items have a common source. The guy was at the crime scene. And the defense, the other side, says they have a different source. It wasn't my guy that left this. Who knows who it was? And so you could think, and there's a jury, right? So the jurors are instructed at the beginning of the trial to pretend or presume that the defendant is innocent until proven guilty. And so how to formalize that in terms of priors is also an interesting question, but I'm not going to go there today. And then the trial starts and evidence is introduced. And so we can think, so at the end of the day, the jurors need to decide whether the evidence is in support of the prosecution's hypothesis or the defense's hypothesis. So this is the posterior odds. If we look at Bayes' theorem in the odds form, let's say, this would be the posterior odds of one evidence versus one hypothesis versus the other, and that we can write as a product of a likelihood ratio, which is this thing in the middle, and the prior odds. The prior odds I'm going to think like a forensic examiner, and so the only thing that the forensic examiner should worry about is the likelihood ratio, because we interpret that as what are the chances of observing the evidence we have observed if the prosecutor is right, relative to the chances of observing the same evidence if the defense is right. And so this is the question of interest. And I'm going to talk, this is a little technical thing. In reality, we're always talking about Bayes factors because we have to estimate parameters and integrate those out, but that's a technical problem that I'm not going to get in. And we've been using this formulation for decades in DNA. So for DNA, we have data, we have a biological model, we have a probabilistic model that is very consistent with what we know about the biology, and so we can apply this type of approach. In other cases, it's a little bit more complicated. There's a case recently where a wife, this is in Italy, this is here, sorry, it was in Texas. A woman was accused of shooting her husband, and the evidence was 2 particles that were identified as gunshot residue that were lifted from the woman's nightgown. And so what they did is they fitted a Poisson model that, what's the chances of observing 2 particles if the person actually fired a gun relative to the probability of observing 2 particles if the person did not fire a gun. And so that was an attempt to applying this approach. It was pretty, kudos to them, but it was pretty bad because they used some data from Italy that was collected on police that are used to handling guns. It was just not a very good application. When you have a pattern, it gets really complicated. So, now you have to find a way to quantify the similarity between perhaps this shoe and this print, and ask yourself, how likely am I to observe this degree of similarity if the defendant's shoe is the one that made the print versus if somebody else's shoe made the print. Now, this is a very difficult problem because you have one image like this one, for example, that's blurry, partially observed, subject to all kinds of background effects, and then you have a nice image. And this has tens of thousands of pixels, no obvious features that you're going to be focusing on. And so how do you do this? Well, we rely on black boxes. So I'm going to give you an example from forensic handwriting analysis. So, you know, you might find somebody may go to a bank and say, I have a gun, give me the money or I'll kill you. And then you might, so that's your suspect. And then you may have some reference writing from the same person, right? Hi, mama. And so can you tell whether the same person wrote these two notes? And so at this moment, like I said, we rely on the expertise of the examiners, and the final decision is subjective. So let's see. Could we do something a little bit more, quote unquote, scientific? And so I'll tell you a little bit. There's any number of publications that have been put out recently that look at you know, deep learning methods for image comparisons and so on. And Kim et al. Here just appeared in 2024 in the Statistical Analysis and Data Mining Journal, and it's a pretty good paper. So the idea is, can we train some sort of deep learner to find features in handwriting that are discriminatory? And there's challenges to doing this. There's no gigantic databases of annotated or labeled handwriting samples for training. The actual samples that you have to work with tend to be relatively small. But you know, here's a possible approach. So what these folks proposed is, here you have a handwritten document. You can use some text recognition software to identify words. So each of these little squares is a word. And then you can do, for example, you can bootstrap this sample of words. You know, some of those samples are not, some of those tiny images are not going to have enough writing in them, so you could crop, for example. You could get rid of the little sub-images that have less, let's say, than a certain information value. And then here you have a bunch of images that you can actually feed to a learner. And as I said, you know, there's some issues like few labeled handwritten samples, but you can rely on transfer learning, and there's many pre-trained models that will help you with that, you know. Then, you know, the dimensionality tends to be very high, but again, you could reduce the dimension of the vectors, of the latent vectors that represent the image using different methods. An autoencoder is one possibility, a IMS network is another possibility. And in the work that I'll show you, both of those were used. And so here are two potential architectures to look at that problem. So here's an autoencoder. You have your samples, you feed them to your feature extractor, and then, you know, magic happens in here. And then, you know, you get the output and the features, and this is what you input into your encoder. The encoder comes up with a much lower dimensional latent vector, and then the vector is decoded and the original images are regenerated. Or you can use a Siamese network where you have two networks that have identical architecture. You feed one document into one, the other document into the other. You end up with two latent vectors, and then you compute some sort of similarity metric between these two latent vectors. So in this particular paper, they tried all kinds of things, but the strategy was to compare two pre-processing feature extractors and, three feature extracting methods and two pre-processing methods, and the autoencoder versus the Siamese network. And they used about 6,000 documents from a database that is publicly available, by the way, from CSAFE, from our center. If you go to this website, you will find it. And it was tested on a different set of documents from different writers from the same database, and on a database that is also publicly available from the University of Vienna. It's called the CVL database. And the results were fabulous. Very, very high accuracy, mid to high 90s. when testing on either set, cosine similarities when looking at pairs of documents were super high, when the pairs of documents were written by the same person, and low otherwise. And what you have here is, in the testing documents, the blue here is the distribution of that cosine similarity metrics among pairs of documents that were written by different people. The red are the similarities among pairs of documents known to have been written by the same person. This is when we tested on the CSAFE database. This is on the CVL database. And so there's very little overlap here. So you could think, if I have a real case and I have a similarity, I compute the similarity score between two documents, and I get a 0.5, let's say, chances are this is going to be a different source type of conclusion, because I don't get to observe similarities that low when I know that ground truth is same source. And so you could think about computing what's called a score-based likelihood ratio. And so if you have some similarity metric S and some densities, some conditional densities for S under the prosecution and the defense's hypotheses, then you could compute a score-based likelihood ratio that you could interpret as follows. If I have a similarity equal to S star, then that observed similarity is SLR times more likely under the prosecution's proposition than otherwise. Now, if you've been paying attention, you realize that there's a lot of hand waving here, because we're going from K features to a univariate similarity score, so there's a huge information loss here. And the question is, and we know that this score-based likelihood ratio is not the same as the likelihood ratio if we were able to compute it. And so there's an issue of coherence here. I mean, is this even, so if I expect the likelihood ratio to be, let's say, above 1 and follow the prosecution, and favor the prosecution, can I also expect the score-based likelihood ratio to lead to the same conclusion? And that's an open question. And there's a group at South Dakota State University. Chris Saunders is the lead of that group, and my colleague Danica Oman at Iowa State, and they're looking into this issue. I know they'll come up with something interesting. So in practice, this is what you might do. So this is, this is just counts. So if you want to be really empirical, you might compute a score-based likelihood ratio by simply seeing which, if I get a score, let's say 0.72, is that more likely under the blue distribution or under the red distribution? And in this case, you would say it's 8 times more likely that the documents were written by different people. There's any number of other examples of the use of AI methods in forensic and criminal justice applications: image comparison, sound classification, predictive algorithms, should we let this person out of jail or not? A lot of that is junk, but some of them are pretty good. But the big issue is that everything is a black box. So all of these algorithms are a completely opaque black box. And there's two types of opacity. First of all, we don't know what these algorithms are doing. And second of all, many of these algorithms are proprietary. So you don't have access to the algorithm or the data that were used to train it or anything else. And so there's really no information about them. The problem is that in the US criminal justice system, defendants have a right to question their accusers. And so if somebody comes and uses one of these black boxes, you're out of luck. Unless, because you have no access to that, unless the judge declares that, the code has to be released or something along those lines. Now, this is not a new problem. This is not a problem of AI. In the United States, there's two pieces of software that are used to analyze DNA mixtures. One of them is StarMix, the other one is TrueAllele. Both of those are proprietary. None of those has been independently examined. NIBIN, which is a national system that allows examiners to search for similar bullets or cartridge cases and see whether they have hits. Can I find another situation where the same gun may have been used in a crime? That is another humongously black box. And there's many more. Some of these may be fine. I'm not saying that these methods are not right. I'm just saying they have not undergone independent testing. And as a defendant, you have no right to look under the hood. I mean, you have no possibility of looking under the hood. So the question is, should we be proposing more black box methods for use in the criminal justice system? And there's a recent paper by Brendan Garrett, who's a lawyer at Duke, and Cynthia Rudin, who I think we all know, also at Duke, that just appeared in the proceedings in 2023. And they argue what I'm arguing here, right? That algorithms ought to be a glass box if they're going to be used in the criminal justice system. So they should be interpretable in the sense that calculations and the variables that are used in the calculations should be accessible to all of us. So we should be able to not necessarily reproduce, but at least understand the calculations that are happening inside the algorithm. And we should also know which variables were driving the results and how those were combined and so on and so forth. And these algorithms could be extraordinarily complex. That's not related to interpretability. But for example, in the case of images, we should know which are the salient pixels, but more than that, we should also know how the pixels, for example, from the training data and the test images correspond, and how those associations are interpreted. So there's interpretable AI and explainable AI. Explainable AI is not the same thing. Explainable AI is when you have a black box, and then you go back and you try to come up with explanations of what the algorithm was doing. And this is definitely not as good as interpretability. It's better than nothing, I imagine. So how much time do I have? I have no idea. How much? Heaven. Okay. So let me talk about some interpretable methods in forensic science. And the first one I'm going to talk about is handwriting. And what I am going to do is I am going to use the exact same data that were used in that black box, in that deep learning paper. But now I'm going to do something that's completely interpretable. I am going to develop a statistical model to compute, for example, the probability of writership of a document if I have a large number of potential writers of that document. So you have handwriting. How do you extract data from handwriting? Well, this is not a new idea. This has been around forever. But one approach to do that is to come up with some sort of rules that takes a handwritten document and then breaks the handwriting into smaller graphical structures that are easier to analyze. And we have written a package that does exactly that. It's also in the public domain. So it's on CRAN, actually. It's called Handwriter, and feel free to play with it. And you can download data from the CSAFE website. And here's an example of what might happen, right? So you have the word CSAFE, for example, and there's a set of rules that puts notes in certain parts of the word, and then you end up breaking this word into these little pieces. Now, these are graphics. These are just small graphs. They have a topology. And so you can, in principle, think about modeling those graphs, right? So this is actually data. And so that's exactly what we do. So if you take a document, and let's suppose it's a paragraph, let's say 6 or 8 sentences or maybe fewer, and you break the writing into these little graphs, you end up with about 400 graphs, or 400 graphs, depending on the content. And so that's a lot of graphs, and they're all little tiny bit different. And so one of the things we proposed was to say, can we cluster these graphs? And so so that we have fewer things, different things to deal with. And so in a paper that appeared also in Statistical Analysis and Data Mining, we proposed this distance metric for graphs. That's an expanded edit distance metric. And the way we expanded it is we added a component that had to do with the properties of the edges. And so, and each one of the clusters then can be represented by what we call an exemplar. And an exemplar would be the graph that's closest to all the other graphs in the same cluster. So for example, for a document, you might end up with, as I said, 400 graphs or so. And these are 40 clusters that we have constructed from that document. The red here is the exemplar, and the little shadowed things are the other graphs that ended up in the same clusters. And so I can use this as a template, because if I now have these 40 clusters, each one represented by an exemplar, I can take any document. Using this template, I can extract the graphs from, first of all, I can extract the graphs from the document, and using this template, I can allocate the different graphs in the document to each one of these clusters. And so what I end up with is, for each document, I end up with a k-dimensional vector of cluster frequencies. So k here would be 40. And the question that you ask yourself is, if I have a bunch of documents written by a bunch of different people, can I compute this, can I distinguish the writers by looking at the pattern of frequencies in these different clusters? And so here you have 3 writers. And the height here just tells you about, and each one of these bars is one of those 40 clusters. And the heights just tell you about the abundance of graphs that each one of these writers contributed to each one of those clusters. So that's not the only information we can extract. We can look at the slant of the writing, for example. And so if I take each graph and I calculate the angle with respect to the horizontal, I end up with thousands of rotation angles for these graphs that can also provide information. So what we ended up doing was coming up with a hierarchical model in 2 pieces, one for the frequencies and the other one for the rotation angles. The frequencies are modeled as multinomial and very simple priors, a Dirichlet prior for the probability vectors, vector probabilities, and hyperprior for the Dirichlet parameters. And then the rotation angles, you have to be a little bit more careful because, of course, they are restricted, so we used a Rab-Cauchy on a circle. And the Rab-Cauchy has a location parameter and a concentration parameter. And again, you can put priors on those, and you're on your way. And so you fit the model, and you get estimates of all of those parameters. And now I have a question document. Let's call that question document W star. And I have a bunch of potential writers for this document. So what I can do now is compute the posterior probability for each potential writer that he or she is the author of W star. This is all in 2023, the Annals of Applied Stats appeared. So here's the case for one. So, here you have on the x-axis, I have like 90 potential writers, and I have one question document. And if I do those calculations, I end up with 85%, 0.85 posterior probability on writer, whatever it is, 13, of being the author, 11% probability on writer 89, and then there's another writer here that gets 4%. And so in this particular case, you would say, it's pretty likely that it was writer 13. So we did this little study where we had 160 writers and 100, so with multiple samples, and we retained one back, so we had 160 question documents, and the question was, can we allocate each one of those 160 to the right person, to the right writer? And so if the allocation had been perfect, you would only see something here along the diagonal. There's a few writers, for example, this document here was allocated to the wrong writer. This document over here was also allocated to the wrong writer. But overall, it was the accuracy of this approach was pretty much the same as the accuracy we got with a deep learning with a deep neural net approach and the encoder and the Siamese and all the other things, except that this is completely, completely transparent. We tested the approach on very many different data sets. This is Swiss data set. And when you had 4 test sentences, 4 sentences in the test document, perfect allocation. When you had 3 sentences, also pretty good allocation. Things start getting a little iffy when you have only 2 sentences in the question document, and then when you have only 1 sentence with about 9 or 10 words, then of course you lose a lot of accuracy. So we're working on that. Let me give you another example. This is going to be much shorter, I promise. This is tool marks. So there's a robbery, somebody jammed a window and got into a house, and you have a defendant. The defendant has a screwdriver. Was the screwdriver of the defendant used to jam the window? And so this is a very difficult problem because you can take a screwdriver and apply it with different force, different angle, different inclination. So there's many degrees of freedom in this problem. Maria Cuellar and collaborators just published a paper in Forensic Science International in 2024. And they did this very interesting experiment. So they had 2 screwdrivers, a small one and a large one. And this, you cannot see in detail, but this is this rigged machine where you can control the pressure, the angle of attack, the yaw, and all kinds of other things to get marks. They got marks in pieces of aluminum, I think it was. And then they had this cute 3D scanner to get 3-dimensional images of those marks. So what you end up with, this is a rendering of one of those marks in 3 dimensions. And imagine you make a crosscut somewhere here. And this is the crosscut. This is what you see in the crosscut. So this piece over here corresponds to this shoulder over here. This other one corresponds to this shoulder. And then this here is the cutting surface of the marking surface of the screwdriver. On one side, there's 2 sides, which also complicates things. And so if you want to extract some information, the first thing you would do probably is get rid of the shoulders. And then maybe what you're interested in is the striations, right? So how about you fit a linear regression to those marks? And then here's the striations themselves. Here's the mark from the screwdriver, and the blue is the curve you're fitting. And what I'm showing you here is what they call the signal. This is essentially the residuals from the regression that was fitted. And so the signal here tells you about the striations, right? So how they go up and down and so on the surface of the screwdriver. And I'm showing you 2 signals here, one overlaid on the other one. And once you have this, you're golden, right? Because you can do many things. You could, for example, calculate differences between these 2 curves, between the 2 signals. The displacement of the peaks, the displacement of the valleys, the area of the difference. I mean, there's any number of things you could compute. What these authors did, they said, we're just going to use a cross-correlation function, and that's going to be our similarity metric. And so this is, don't try to figure out what the details are, but this is a similarity matrix. It's a heat map of the similarities. And there's 2 sides to each screwdriver. There were 20 small screwdrivers, and I don't remember what else they were varying here, but if there was absolutely perfect information, you would only see orange along the main diagonal. You see some other, the gray means no similarity, the orange means high similarity. And so if you do what we talked about earlier and calculate look at the distribution of cross-correlation values among known non-matching marks and the correlations, the cross-correlations among pairs of known matching marks made by the same screwdriver, here's what you would get. And so there seems to be a lot of information. In fact, the value of 0.67 is a good threshold. And so if I have now 2 marks from a crime scene, one from the suspect's screwdriver and one from the window that was jammed, I can actually compute the cross-correlation function. If it's above 0.67, I'm, more likely to think it was, in fact, the defendant's screwdriver. If it's below, I am more likely to think that it was not. So, there is so much work to do. I showed you 2 tiny little examples, and I didn't even start doing justice to this area. I mean, I just talked about pattern disciplines, but there is any number of other disciplines that deserve attention. Those would include drug identification, time of death estimation, toxicology. I mean, any number of disciplines where there's a huge need for serious statistical work. People get thrown in jail, they lose their freedom, sometimes they lose their life on the basis of some really faulty forensic decisions. And so we have to get it right? So this is a responsibility that we have as statisticians and other scientists too, to getting it right. There isn't a whole lot of funding in this area, but there is some funding. NSF has a program that will fund forensics work. The National Institute of Justice has some funding for this. And CSAFE, our center, which this year had a little bit of an issue with funding, so we've been wounded, but not fatally. Hopefully, as of next year, we'll be back in operation full steam ahead, and we also do have some funding to work on this type of problems. So if you happen to be interested, check the website, get in touch. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Now we open the floor for questions. Yeah, please.
Great talk.
Thank you.
So in your very cool handwriting example, where you have your graphs and things, and then you kind of construct this compositional vector based on clustering.
Yeah.
The handwriting graphs. It seems on the surface anyway that the clusters are going to be like kind of letter. The letter is going to come in, and then you would expect that like the proportion of different letters in a note to mom might be systematically different than letter proportions in a note, a ransom note. And so, once you want to adjust for the letter proportion,
That's a very good question. And let me tell you, first of all, I hadn't thought of that. But second of all, it's not necessarily letters. So for example, if you look at this decomposition, this is an A, and the algorithm will break it into 2 pieces. And so it depends more on the shape of the writing than on the actual content, the actual letters of the writing. What graphs do you end up with? And so you make an interesting point, though, that one should look into. Yeah. Maybe we hadn't run into this problem because most of the prompts that we've been using have been different prompts but repeated.
There was another question here.
Yes.
So I had a question. So as we continue to implement statistical tools to interpret DNA evidence in general forensic evidence, do you think that glass box methods will become black box methods for forensic scientists that are on the bench and the jury? And if so, how could we ensure that these methods are implemented in a way that is understood by forensic scientists and also in the courtroom?
That is another excellent question. So the question is, how do we ensure that these methods, let's suppose that we use these methods. At the end of the day, it's not the scientist that's presenting this, it's the forensic examiner that's using and interpreting results and presenting them to juries and lawyers that know nothing about science in general. That's a very difficult issue. I mean, it gets much worse when you have black boxes, right? So what we try to do in CSAFE is to build glass boxes so that at least we can sit with examiners, and we do work with examiners very closely, and explain to them. They won't understand the nooks and crannies, but they will understand the general idea. And the serious forensic examiners will tend to use methods they halfway understand. There's, of course, the ones that will say whatever. But there's still the issue that interpretation of results can be pretty tricky and pretty subtle, and there's a lot of training that needs to happen.
Can I do a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Do you think that that training has to happen at the, I guess, like at what point in the career of forensic scientists is that? Like, do you think that that's something that maybe the field of forensic science will need to start moving towards more statistics training earlier on, and so that that focus is to be there from the very beginning?
I think so. I think, after working for 10 years in this area, I think that we have to have some sort of literacy, quantitative literacy training for lawyers, judges, forensic examiners, yeah. The system, we have this crazy system, right? It's an adversarial system. So the purpose is not to find truth. The purpose is to prove the other side wrong, or at least to be more credible than the other side. So that also makes it difficult for an examiner to testify, I'm 85% certain, or the probability is 85%. Because the other side is going to come and say, well, what about the other 15%? And so it's not a system conducive to good science, but we have to keep trying.
There's Yang Hai and there's a question in the back.
Yeah. Who?
Yeah.
You mentioned that you compared it to some deep network, a deep learning model, and it was comparable. What model did you compare it to, and how much loss was there using your flash box to the state-of-the-art?
Okay, so we use the same exact data, the same samples, and we fitted this this deep learning model that had a feature extractor, an autoencoder, and then a similarity, metric. We use cosine similarity for that one, and we had very high. Very, very high accuracy, even when the documents that we were testing with were very short, like a sentence or two. We took the exact same data, and we fitted this other model that I was telling you about. We took some of those writers to create a template. Then we took a different set of writers that had multiple writing samples to fit the model, and then from each one of those, we kept a document outside to use as question. And for the medium-sized documents and larger documents, we got pretty comparable accuracy, so mid-90%. Where we found differences was when we had a short test document, and then the clustering approach, the model, suffered. So we went down from 95% accuracy to maybe 78 or 80% accuracy. So there was an advantage of the of the deep learning approach for very short documents. So what this tells me is we need to work harder to find an interpretable method for short documents.
Dan first, the second, you're next.
Yeah,
like Dan.
you and then you.
So another problem, and maybe this is just a bias of the area that I work in, but I think you hinted at it, is that even if you suppose that we are able to make every examiner reasonably accurate, evidence is only selectively introduced. And so the reference population that we're considering in terms of our accuracies is really truncated and conditioned only to those scenarios where the reported likelihood appears with very high certainty. And in addition, I imagine that prosecutors or defense attorneys could also solicit multiple examiners and then only report results from the examiners that they like.
Yeah.
So even if all the examiners were perfectly exchangeable and highly accurate, you still have this problem with either sort of multiple comparisons, picking the one you like best, or selective reporting and only choosing to introduce the evidence that has this high degree of certitude. And so I wonder if you've considered ways like tools from selective inference might be brought to bear here to allow you to sort of condition on being in those tails.
Yes, that's another excellent point. I mean, I just talked about this one little piece where statistics is important, but you're absolutely right. So, not to toot my own horn, but Susan van der Plas, one of my colleagues, and Heike Hoffman and myself just published a paper in the proceedings where we look at this multiple comparisons issue. And, you know, multiple comparisons arise in many different ways. For example, if I'm an examiner and I'm getting test shots to compare to the one bullet I have from the crime scene, there's nothing that says I cannot get 547 test shots until I find one that actually has similar marks. There is nothing that says this, you know, and this happens. And so statistics comes in everywhere, in every single aspect of forensic sciences, and there are so precious few of us working in this area. So I see Karen over there, Karen Kafadar, and I don't know if Hal Stern is here, but Hal Stern and who? Oh, yes, and multiple students, and not enough.
I have a question about the handwriting and evidence based on handwriting. I mean, thinking thinking like a criminal, I would probably write on my left hand or try to disguise my handwriting, not to be caught.
Yeah.
But there may be some other tests, for example, fingerprints, DNA, which are more accurate than that. So, in clinical trials, regulatory people would look at more gold standard tests compared to some new instruments which are proving efficacy. They correlate them together and
Sure.
come to validating the new tools. So I was wondering, like, handwriting or bullet shells, are they correlated with some more gold standard evidences like fingerprints and stuff, which is
Yeah, so sometimes you get lucky, and there's all kinds of different types of evidence you can get from a crime scene. Sometimes you're really lucky and you find some biological material, and then you can do DNA, and then you're golden. But sometimes you don't. And so what happens in real life is that you have all these different pieces of evidence that are introduced. And so there may be a partial print, and so what's the likelihood ratio for that? And then there may be a handwritten note, what's the likelihood ratio for that? And unless you have some reason to assume that these pieces of evidence are not independent, why should your fingerprint have anything to do with your handwriting? You can actually multiply those likelihood ratios to come up with a joint, weight of the entire body of evidence. And that's done. And so, maybe the handwritten note doesn't weigh anything in the end, but sometimes it's the thing that gets it. Yeah.
There's another question here, I think.
Here, and then another one over, yeah. Yeah.
I'm just curious, with the software and the methods that you're developing, who's the end user? Will it be like centralized crime labs, or are you shooting to have like your average police department? I'm just curious.
No, this is excellent. I mean, so one of the things we have done in CSAVE is try to understand what are the barriers for implementing this type of new technologies in real crime labs. So we actually work with real crime labs. And one of the algorithms we have developed is an algorithm to compare bullets. Similar to the hand, the screwdriver thing, we have another one for bullets that has been tested quite a bit. And right now, there's about 5 crime labs in the US that are pilot testing that on their real samples. And so we're working closely with them. Of course, things go belly up when you try to implement them in real world. But we're working closely with them so that we can keep making. The handwriter package is being tested by the Secret Service as we speak. And again, it went belly up the first time, and then we started working with them closely and so on. So yes, those would be the end users. The end users would be the forensic scientists in crime labs that receive the evidence. Yeah.
For my criminal friend over there, if you use your left hand, you may not be understood.
Yeah.
I'm more serious. So you're using one person for graphs there,
Mm-hmm.
and then you
So, so we have, okay, so from the database that we have constructed, we have about 400 individuals. Each one provided about 27 samples of writing. We tormented our participants. And so we have a ton of documents. And so just using our database, but we tend to mix and match, but just using our database, you can use a sample of those writers to construct the template. You know, do the clustering and so on, so you get your template. And then you have a bunch of other writers for which you have many or more than one handwritten samples. And so you could take part of those documents to fit a model. And then using that fitted model, and let's suppose that you keep one document back from each writer as your questioned. And so using the fitted model, you can ask yourself, can I allocate each one of those 160 documents to the correct writer? And so that's one of the things we've done.
So how would you apply this in a criminal case?
So in a criminal case, let's suppose you have somebody comes to the convention center and leaves a note that says there's a bomb. So all of us are potential writers of that note, right? And so what you would do in a criminal case is you would have samples of writing from each one of us. You would have a suspect, or no, you would have the note. And so you would process each one of those documents through this same method, extract the graphs, construct the clusters, and so on. And then you would fit the same model, well, you would fit the model to the reference samples that we get from each one of us. And then you would use that model to compare our writing, each one of our writings, to that one criminal note.
Okay, but in your example, we're all suspects.
Yes.
There's 5,000 of us who are suspects.
Yes.
In a real case, you arrested this person, you may have no other.
That's a very good question. That's what we would call an open set. And so what I've been talking about is a closed set. So you know that the writer has to be one of those. So in the case of the open set, we have also worked on that problem. What you end up doing is something a little bit more similar to what you do with screwdrivers. So you still use the frequencies and maybe even the slant of the writing as features. And then you combine those, maybe using some simple algorithm, maybe a random forest, maybe a logistic regression. And so what you do is you have an experimental data set with lots of documents. You construct pairs of documents that you know were written by the same person and pairs of documents that you know were written by different people. And then looking at the difference in the features, you can, so the difference in the features, for example, the frequencies, that is your new feature vector for each one of those pairs. And then you can summarize that feature vector, like I said, for example, using a logistic regression or a random forest or something that's kind of interpretable, and that will give you a similarity score. It will give you the probability of same source for each one of those pairs. And so you end up with a distribution of same source scores and a distribution of different source scores. And so if you come and you say, I have this suspect and I have this document, what's the chances that that he's the author? You compute the similarity between those two documents, and then you compare back to those two distributions. Let me see, do I have that here? Yeah. So then you compare back to those two distributions as in that case. So that's what you would do for the open set scenario.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
So I suspect that the advocates of using statistics or this class of to make this type of decision are trying to mitigate the bias that would have been produced if humans were trying to make this decision. But as you have shown, these statistical tools have their own limitations.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah. So the question is, do we know that these methods are any better than the examiners themselves, right? And the answer is we don't really know because understandably, examiners are a little reluctant to participate in a test where there's an algorithmic competitor. But we did one small study where we had about 35 firearms examiners, and the algorithm that I told you was being tested in crime labs right now. And the results, the 35 examiners were pretty good in the sense that there was only one false positive decision and a couple of false negatives, but about 35% of the decisions were inconclusive, whereas the algorithm made no mistakes and no inconclusives. So in this tiny, tiny little example, we have pretty promising findings, but no, there hasn't been extensive testing.
Yeah, please.
I was wondering if you started out talking about false convictions. I was wondering if you could describe approaches that have been used to try to exonerate previously convicted patients.
Yeah.
Suspects.
Yes. So the best, of course, is DNA, right? So many of the people that have been wrongfully convicted were convicted in the 80s or the 70s. I mean, people spend 40 years in prison for crimes they haven't committed, which is truly horrific. And in many of those cases, there's DNA. So that at the time was not analyzed because forensic DNA analysis didn't exist. And so the Innocence Project, I'm sure you've heard about them, has focused on those cases where there is DNA that can be reanalyzed. And so oftentimes you find that the person in jail had nothing to do with the crime. When there isn't DNA, then you have a problem because then it is, as she said, he said. And in some jurisdictions, you will find judges that are willing to reopen a case and look at the post-conviction, so do some sort of post-conviction review. But you would have to have, for example, a prosecutor that comes and says, I hid evidence, or I knew this person was not the culprit, but I had to find somebody. Or, or the witnesses come and recant and say, I found Jesus and I'm so sorry. But, you have to, and, this happens in many places, and the judge says, so sorry, show me proof. And so it's difficult to prove innocence after the fact if you don't have DNA. Yeah.
Do you see any push towards open source software, not even for deep learning, but for like DNA profile, like a star mix? Do you see any trend that is trying to get into that? Because most of this software is proprietary and is closed code.
I am hoping. I mean, judges have been started. So lawyers are kind of slow to realize that they have these things that they can use. And so they've started challenging the proprietary evidence. And so it has happened that there's been some judges that have said, if you're not willing to open the code, then I'm not admitting this evidence. And so it doesn't mean that, for example, StarMix has to publish the code. It would mean that there should be, a non-disclosure agreement and some independent expert that may be hired by the defense that gets to look at the code or test the code. So, open source doesn't mean everybody gets it. It could be very limited, and I think there's a push for that, and I think it's eventually they're going to take so many hits that something's going to have to happen. I hope. Yes.
Yeah, please.
There was one.
He's first. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
In teaching, one thing I enjoy doing is using video clips from the TV series called Numbers.
Oh yes, I love it.
Okay, so I was wondering if you could comment on the series from your perspective.
Numbers, which unfortunately it's not shown anymore, right?
Right, that was a 6 series.
Yeah.
So yeah, it concluded about
PCA, they talked about PCA.
Yes, but that was actually pretty good because they had some wasn't a Fields Medal an advisor for that series? I mean, there was some real mathematicians that were advising. And so I loved that series because it was sort of realistic. Now, then you have CSI. And CSI is the opposite. And so no, this is the most unrealistic. Everybody thinks, you go, you press 3 buttons, and suddenly you have the culprit, but that's not the way it goes at all. And so, yeah, I love it. But you have to be careful with the source, talk about source, yeah.
There was a question there.
Yeah, you made a comment about the craziness of the adversarial system and the implications that the system has on the way in which evidence is treated. Can you say something about different systems, for example, the French system, and if there are differences in the way the evidence is
Yeah, so not that I am super familiar with other systems, but for example, in the Netherlands, there's not a jury. So what you have is a judge, and then you have the prosecution, and then you have the defense. But the prosecution is a team that has a lawyer and has scientists that have the relevant expertise, and the same with the defense. And so rather than having, rather than putting up a show for a jury, they really do get into the serious nitty-gritty and discuss scientific things and so on. In the United States, judges have the ability to call their own expert. So if you have the prosecution's expert says X and the defense expert says Y, and they don't agree, the judge can actually call one or more experts from outside to advise her directly or him. It's rarely done, unfortunately, but it could be done. And so I think the jury system with the adversarial the adversarial system is pretty unique to the United States. I may be wrong, but I think it's pretty unique to the United States.
Well, it's based on the British system.
Yeah. But even the British have done away with it, I think. Maybe not, I don't know. Yeah. Handwriting is, you'd think handwriting is old school, but not yet. And so most ransom notes, most criminal notes, you have no idea how many nuts every day threaten the President of the United States, for example, I'm going to kill you. And so the Secret Service collects all those things. And so it is true that there's less handwriting, if you will, but there's still a bunch of it left. There's a lot of handwriting on instruments such as, tablets and so on and so forth. And so that means that you can get other features from the handwriting, such as the pressure, the speed of writing, the direction of the strokes, and so on and so forth, that one could, for example, incorporate to analyze that type of writing, the one that is made on tablets. You can expect almost anything. The firearms, unfortunately, are here to stay. The amount of things that are introduced into evidence is incredible. The stitching on the shirts, for example, that, there was a case not too long ago where somebody had put, I don't know, a dead person or something in a big garbage bag, one of these black bags. And the examiner compared the tearing on the bottom of the black bag with the tearing of the roll of black bags that was in the suspect's house. And who knew that that was possible? And so said, these two things match. This black bag came from this house. I mean, completely ad hoc and with no supporting information. So anything that you can think about is probably going to be introduced into evidence at some point or another.
Any other? Yeah, please.
Can you comment on the need for proof beyond a reasonable doubt?
What does it mean in probabilistic terms?
Sure.
Well,
What are prosecutors thinking about, or the defendants?
well, yes, in the sense that you have to have a pretty tight story. So what they, the prosecution presents a story. The defense in the United States doesn't have to present a story. The only thing they need to do is poke holes at the prosecution story. And so ideally, they have a very tight story with nice evidence where holes are not possible, or it's not easy to poke holes. But it all depends on how the jury views, first of all, the story, how they liked the experts. Maybe one of the experts sort of, turned them, was not friendly enough. There's so many things that go into a jury's decision. And from a probabilistic point of view, this is like trying to say, what is the probability that correctly represents innocent until proven guilty, right? So what's beyond a reasonable doubt? That's one of those abstract ideas. I think most everybody would say 0.95 and above, I have no idea. In civil cases, it's 0.51, so it's preponderance. And that's easier, right? It's 0.51, that's it. But beyond a reasonable doubt is harder.
Any other questions? Yeah, please.
I just have a practical question. Many of us will end up on juries at some point, and after seeing this talk and realizing that many of the evidentiary standards are less than ideal, how do we strike that balance on a jury, as a jurist?
I'd love to be in a jury. I've never been called. I've been called, but I've never been seated. You have to be, it's great to be aware, right? And so you have to think like a statistician or like a scientist. When somebody says these two things match, you say, how do you know? And, show me the data. So that's the number one thing you need to think about. And most juries probably don't think in those terms, right? Most juries think that, this guy is from the FBI, the expert is, would the FBI lie to me? And, and would they not know what they're talking about? And so most jurors are pretty impressed. And there's this long-standing belief, for example, that because forensic technologies have not been questioned in the past and have been used for years and years and years, it must mean that they are reliable. And only now are people starting to question the reliability of some of these methods. And so I think it's going to take a little while for jurors in general to learn to be skeptical. And so for somebody like you that kind of sees and understands at a different level than your normal juror off the streets, I think it's incumbent upon you to make sure that you question and that you explain to your fellow jurors what the limitations of some of these methods might be. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you for staying this long. Lots of questions.